Let's take a look here at the 2015 macro question number one. This is the long FRQ from that year. All right, so there's the question. Assume the United States economy is operating below full employment. Okay, so that's another way to say, okay, a recessionary gap, right? The employment is below the full employment level. All right, part A is going to be draw a correctly labeled graph of long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand, and show each of the following. So essentially, part A is just going to draw, we're going to draw the graph showing a recessionary gap. So this is a pretty straightforward, and they want us to label things in a certain way. I'm going to erase all my previous notes here. Okay, so let's just quickly sketch this out. I got a different color today. Okay, so price level, we have real GDP. Okay, so let's draw our, make sure we label aggregate demand curve, short run aggregate supply. And then we've got to make sure we put the long run aggregate supply in the right spot, right? So we said we're both below full employment, which is another way of saying we're in a recessionary gap. Okay, so let's put our curve off here to the right somewhere. Long run aggregate supply. They also want us to label the full employment level, right, which is down here in real GDP where you're on the LRAS. Then they wanted us to label our actuals. I think this was Y sub 1, and this was PL1. Okay, so there you have just a basic recessionary graph, recessionary gap graph, and that is all of part A for this question. So leave that there, close that out, come back now, and we move on to part B. Assume that the Federal Reserve targets a new federal funds rate to reach full employment. Should the Federal Reserve target a higher or lower federal funds rate? Okay, so this is just essentially a straight up question. What should the Federal Reserve do to close this gap? So we know we're in a recessionary gap. We need to expand our output, right, to try and get closer to full employment output. So therefore, you should be thinking about what does the Federal Reserve need to do to be expansionary? And the question specifically asks about federal funds rate, right? So think about interest rates, right? So what interest rates equal an expansionary policy? So this case should be lower federal funds rate. So you should write a little sentence there. The Federal Reserve should lower the federal funds rate in order to have an expansionary policy to close the output gap. All right, part C. Given the Federal Reserve action you identified in part B, draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market and show the effect on the nominal interest rate. Okay, so let's just sketch this one down here. Okay, quantity of money. Up here we have nominal interest rates. All right, so we have a demand curve for money. We have a money supply. Let's call that money supply 1. Okay, we initially started here. Let's call that R1 rate, interest rate number 1. And what we just talked about in part B, lowering the federal funds rates, right? So what would you have to do on this graph to show a decrease in the interest rate? Well, you need to shift the money supply curve. Let's call it money supply curve 2 and draw an arrow. So that's shifting out, and then the new equilibrium interest rate is down here, right? So we've shown the decrease in interest rates on the money market graph right there. All right, so let's move on to part D. Now, part D, the policymakers pursue a fiscal policy, right? So fiscal policy, and then your other clue in this question, instead of monetary policy, assume that the MPC, right, marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. and the value of the recessionary gap is 300 billion. Okay, so anytime in a question, you get the MPC thrown at you, you should, bells and whistles should go off. Okay, spending multiplier, right? So part one, so if the government changes its spending without changing taxes to eliminate the recessionary gap, calculate the minimum required change in government spending. So this is sort of a backwards question, right? So the first thing we need to do, and I'm going to do this down here, is figure out what the spending multiplier is. Right, we want to figure out what effect any government spending is going to have ultimately, right, through the spending multiplier on real GDP. So that is, right, 1 over 1 minus MPC. In this case, we have 1 over 1 minus 0.8 over 1, which equals 1 over 0.2, which equals 5. Okay, so anything the federal government spends is going to be multiplied times a factor of 5 for its ultimate effect on real GDP. So now we got to go back to this question. This is important. They give you the value, and now the question in part one here wants to know the actual amount of government spending. So some questions might ask about the ultimate effect. This one asks about the change in government spending. So what we know, we can just sort of create a variable for this change in government spending, right? Let's call that equal to X, right? And so we know the gap is 300 billion. So we know the multiplier is 5. So essentially we set up an equation, 5X equals, and our ultimate effect is going to be 300, right? So the question is asking, how much does government need to spend here such that we multiply it times the multiplier of 5 to get an ultimate effect of 300, right? So divide both sides by 5, so you get X equals 300 billion over 5. So therefore, X equals 60 billion. So that's your pretty straightforward spending multiplier question. They do ask you to kind of you got to go backwards, right? So don't forget you have to set up this little equation here in order to calculate the amount the government would need to spend. All right, part two of this, part D, if the government changes taxes without changing government spending to eliminate the recessionary gap, will the minimum required change in taxes be greater than, smaller than, or equal to the minimum required change in government spending in part D1, and then explain. Okay, well, we know that the spending multiplier is always greater than the tax multiplier. So this, again, this is asking about how much the government would have to do in order to have the same effect, right? So if the multiplier is less, and we can go through with a calculation here in a minute, if your multiplier is less, the change in taxes is going to have to be sort of a bigger effect than the amount in government spending. Now the reason, so we set up here, the spending multiplier is equal to 5, we said, which we just calculated up here. Now the tax multiplier is the MPC over the MPS, and it's actually negative because it flips the direction, but we're just comparing magnitude right now. So we get 0.8 over 0.2 for the tax multiplier. So 0.8 over 0.2 is 4, right? And it is flipped, right? So but it's assumed in this question you're talking about a tax decrease, right? So a tax decrease is going to have be multiplied 4 times into real GDP, and the spending multiplier, right, the government spending directly is going to be 5 times, right? So obviously the effect, if you want to equal those out, you would have to do a larger tax decrease than you would have to do of actual spending from over here. So some sort of explanation, if you said, this one is greater than this, therefore, the amount of spending or the amount of the tax cut would have to be larger than the amount of spending, something to that effect, where you say that in a sentence or two. That should get you to points in part 2 there. All right, part E, assume the government lowers income tax rates to eliminate the recessionary gap. Will each of the following increase, decrease, or stay the same? Both of these, I want a little explanation. So Part one is pretty straightforward, right? So we're reducing income tax rates. So think about what that's going to do to different components of GDP, right? So the obvious explanation, so aggregate demand is going to be increased. For explanation, I think you should talk about your consumption components, right? You have lower taxes, so people have higher disposable income, right? So that's obviously going to stimulate consumption and could also stimulate savings, right? So, and therefore the investment component of real GDP. So increase, aggregate demand increase, and then for an explanation, just saying that because of higher disposable income, consumption for sure is going to be increased, and therefore the real GDP is and aggregate demand are increased, something of that effect. All right, so part two is interesting. Long run aggregate supply, and then explain. Now, so the obvious answer to me, at least, is that this will increase in the long run, and the reason being, we just talked about increases in consumption and investment, right? So people have higher disposable income, so they're therefore saving more money. Therefore, we have a higher investment component, right? So higher investment, generally you can talk about a longer term shift in the LRAS curve increasing or shifting rightward. And that's because of this increased investment, right? And capital accumulation, think about factories and things of that nature. So if you have some sort of explanation, LRAS increases because of this investment component. I would mention capital accumulation or capital investment, something along those lines. I think you're good. Now, interestingly, if you look at the rubric for this part of the question, they did give credit for different answers depending upon the correct rationale or correct explanation associated with that. So this was sort of the most obvious answer to me. This is how I would answer it based upon sort of my answer in part one. So they also gave credit. So you couldn't do both of these, right? So you could have said this, or you could have said there's no change. Let's just go sideways, no change. And then if your explanation had something dealing with, well, aggregate demand increased only because, consumption went up. So you obviously couldn't talk about investment, right? There was no change to investment. If you had this rationale, then you would get the point for this one. And then if you wanted to go, there was actually another explanation where they gave credit where LRAS decreased. And the rationale you had to have for that one was that due to the reduction in income tax rates, right? So presumably higher deficit spending, you had to say something about crowding out. Crowding out would lead to less private investment and therefore a longer term downward shift in the LRAS. So part two of E is an interesting question where they essentially gave credit for any possible answer, right? Increase, decrease, or stay the same as long as your rationale and your explanation tied in with that correct response. So, evidence that sometimes in macro, your argument is more important than the objective answer, because in this case, you can make an argument for any case here.